Aria Delacroix returned home. Amelia was praying quietly, and when she saw Aria, a flicker of hope rose in her eyes. But Aria simply shook her head, her face pale and lifeless. Amelia's disappointment was evident, but she couldn't bring herself to scold Aria. Instead, she sighed softly. "You're soaked. Go take a hot bath or you'll catch a cold." Aria nodded weakly. After bathing and taking some medicine, Aria still fell ill. Her head throbbed and her body felt weak. At midnight, Skylar called, eager for updates. Aria explained everything in her hoarse voice. Xavier Ashford must be the reincarnation of Sir Galahad. After all that, he still held back. "Aria, do you think he might have, problems?" Aria replied softly. "No, he's perfectly fine." Skylar let out a relieved sigh. "Well, if his body's fine, then you'll win him over eventually. Just keep at it." Aria gave a weak laugh. She knew better. Unless Xavier wanted her, she would never be able to seduce him. After chatting for a while, Aria hung up and fell back into an uneasy sleep. When she woke up the next day, it was already noon. The house was silent and Amelia was gone. Aria felt even worse. Checking her temperature, she saw it had climbed to 39.5 degrees Celsius. She forced herself to eat something before calling a cab to the hospital. The hospital was crowded. After an hour of waiting, she was finally called in. The doctor prescribed her an 4 drip. By the time Aria was hooked up to the 4, it was already 3 p.m. Exhausted from days of stress and illness, she drifted off in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Xavier Ashford was at the hospital with his mother to pick up some medication. As they were leaving, Xavier's sharp eyes caught sight of Aria in the 4 room. She was asleep. Her pale face looked even more fragile under the harsh hospital lighting, and the 4 needle in her delicate hand added to her vulnerability. Xavier's gaze lingered on her for a few seconds longer than necessary. Mrs. Ashford noticed her son's distraction and followed his gaze. She smiled softly. "Xavier, do you know this young lady?" Xavier replied calmly. "We've met once." Mrs. Ashford looked thoughtful. "She helped me earlier today when I was struggling with the hospital's registration process. I didn't expect you to know her." Xavier's eyes flicked back to Aria. At that moment, Aria stirred awake. When she saw Xavier, she tried to stand up abruptly, forgetting about the 4 needle in her hand. The needle tugged painfully, and a sharp gasp escaped her lips as blood seeped into the transparent tube. Xavier's brows furrowed slightly. Mrs. Ashford's expression was full of sympathy. "Xavier, why don't you stay with her? She looks so pitiful all alone here and sick." Xavier hesitated but ultimately nodded under his mother's persistent gaze. Aria didn't even have time to protest before Mrs. Ashford left with the family driver. As Xavier returned to Aria's side, she sat in her chair, staring blankly ahead. Xavier admitted to himself that he was attracted to Aria, especially her long, slender legs. But that was where it ended. He had no desire to get entangled in her life. Sitting beside her, he asked coolly, "How many bottles left?" Aria looked up, startled. "Just one more." Xavier said nothing more, pulling out his phone to handle work emails. Eventually, Aria drifted back to sleep. Half asleep, she faintly heard Xavier talking to a nurse, and felt a jacket being draped over her bare legs, covering them carefully.